In this video, Magnus Carlsen destroys Richard Rapport and his favorite French defense with an insane Kingside attack. Of course, this game took place in the 2024 Grenke Chess Classic. Now, in the game, Magnus opens 1e4 and his opponent, Richard Rapport, goes for his favorite French defense with e6 and then d5. Now, from here, Magnus Carlsen goes for the main line with knight c3, simply defending that pawn on e4. And very quickly, Richard Rapport busts out the controversial Winaver variation with 3 bishop b4. The idea behind this move is you are pinning that knight on c3. Of course, now black threatens to take the pawn on e4. So Magnus pushes the pawn. Richard Rapport then pressures the center with c5. And now we have this 4 sequence of moves starting with a3, bishop takes c3, and b takes c3. Of course, this is the classic Winaver pawn structure in the middle of the board. So far, this is all theory. And here, black has a wide variety of plans that he can choose from. In the game, he goes knight to e7. The idea behind this move is simply preparing short castling on the king side, and of course that knight doesn't have access to the f6 square, so e7 is obviously the right place. Now from here, black has a wide variety of plans and ideas, but in the game, Richard Rapport does play the move knight to e7. Now from here, the old main line is queen to g4. This is probably the strongest move in the position. However, nowadays there are a lot of grandmasters that really like the idea of 7h4 in this position. This move was popularized originally by AlphaZero way back in, I believe, 2018 or 2019. The idea behind this is simply gaining space on the king side before following up with queen to g4. However, in the game, the immediate queen g4 on the board, and now black has a big choice. He can either defend the pawn on the g7 square, or he can go queen to c7, simply sacrificing the pawn. That is known as the poison pawn variation, and things get very sharp, very fast. And in the game, that is exactly what Richard Rapport goes for. He plays the move queen c7, simply inviting the poison pawn after queen takes g7. From here, things get absolutely insane. The main line is rook g8, simply defending the rook. Then after queen takes h7, black takes the pawn on d4. And already, black is threatening the pawn on e5, and queen takes c3 check, hitting the king and the rook. Now, if you follow Magnus Carlsen's games, you know that he tends to avoid these hyper-theoretical lines. He just likes to outplay his opponents in simple but complicated and unusual positions. So with that in mind, it is no surprise at all that he did not go for the poison pawn variation with queen takes g7. Instead, he plays the equally strong idea of the move bishop to d3 in this position. Okay, what's the idea behind this move? Well, first of all, d3 is the best square for the bishop. From here, it obviously pressures that h7 point, which makes castling on the king side from black very difficult. And white maintains a lot of flexibility here. I mean, he still has the idea of queen takes g7 in the future, and it's kind of passing the torch to black. What are you going to do here? However, instead of going for the poison pawn with queen takes g7, Magnus Carlsen plays the slightly unusual move bishop to d3. Now, if you follow Magnus Carlsen's games, you know he tends to avoid hyper complicated and sharp lines with both sides. And with that in mind, bishop d3 makes a lot of sense. I mean, here Magnus maintains the idea of queen takes g7 in the future. However, for now, he's avoiding those hyper sharp and overanalyzed lines that he likes to avoid, and instead he's getting more of a fresh position. Now, this line has been analyzed quite a bit, but it's still nowhere near as complicated or as studied as the poison pawn variation, so pretty solid choice by Magnus. Now, here Rapport mixes things up. In the game, he goes for the move queen to a5. Instead, typically the main line in this position has been c takes d4. Now, white simply has to go knight e2, defending the c3 point in the position. And then after queen takes e5, white can either go bishop to f4 or c takes d4, and despite being a pawn down, white has pretty good compensation for the material deficit. However, instead of that, Richard Rapport, I mean, this guy is a creative genius. He always mixes things up, even more so than Magnus Carlsen, and here he goes for the move queen to a5. Now, obviously, the threat of this move is pressuring the c3 point. However, it's pretty weird with both sides having these weaknesses that would blow open the position, and what does Magnus do here? Well, it turns out it is completely necessary to defend the c3 point right away, and the best way to do that is bishop d2. Now, this move, bishop d2 here, works a little bit better than knight to e2, and for a specific reason. With that queen on the a4 square, white now has tactical ideas based on c3 to c4. I mean, for example, if black were to castle in this position, then c4 is already very strong. I mean, you have threats against d5, threats against the queen. That is just nasty for black. So instead, Richard plays the standard move in this type of position, with the queen on a5 and the bishop on d2, and that is simply locking down the center with c5 to c4. Now, this is a very double-edged decision. I mean, after white's bishop retreats to e2, here the center is completely locked for both sides. And what that means is both white and black are going to have to fight tooth and nail on the king side and the queen side way away from the center. Now here, Richard Rapport obviously has to do something about this g7 pawn. He starts rook g8. It's a good move in the position, however, it does have one problem. The king is no longer able to castle on the king side. Now, of course, that would not be a good idea in this position. For example, if Richard went short castles, that would be just absolute suicide here. I mean, white just has way too many attacking ideas. Queen h5, threatening checkmate in one move, h2 to h4 to h5. White's ideas are just endless, and the attacking chances are just too much. So instead, rook g8 on the board, the best move, but you really have to know what you're doing as black here. I mean, technically the king still can castle on the queen side. However, Richard has to be very careful not to do that too quickly, because white can very quickly get attacking chances on the queen side. I mean, this b file is already open, and he is playing Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, so you don't want to give that guy attacking chances with the open b file. Okay, Magnus, what does he do here? Well, he starts with the best move, a3 to a4. This is a very important move here. If Magnus did not do that, let's say, I don't know, knight f3, something like that, then Richard Rapport could play queen to a4 at some point, and this completely locks in the pawn on the a3 square. Now, this is very, very important from here. Obviously, the pawn is locked down, but black also gets permanent pressure on that c2 pawn, and it's not so easy to figure out how to defend it. And beyond that, when Magnus plays a4, he actually gains access to the a3 square for the dark squared bishop. I mean, there may be some situation in the future where Magnus has that knight on the e2 square supporting c3, and then from there he can go bishop c1 to a3, trying to activate the bishop on this diagonal here. So overall, a4, a multi-purpose move, locking queen a3, which would be very good for Richard, and setting up future bishop c1 to a3 ideas. Okay, this is a good time to talk strategy. Things are about to get a little bit slower in this game. So from here, what is black's idea? Well, he's probably going to start knight c6 and bishop d7, and from there, Richard's going to have the option of castling on the queen side, but it's also important not to do it too quickly, because if Richard overcommits his king to the queen side too soon, then Magnus could get an attack going on the queen side with, I don't know, knight f3, short castles, then rook f to b1. In addition, Richard also has to think about stopping white's kingside play on the king side. That may include ideas like knight f5, increasing support of the g7 square, or even g6 and h5, trying to kick the queen back and gaining more space. Now, Magnus Carlsen, on the other hand, for right now, his best idea is going to be gaining space on the king side and trying to start an attack. And there are a few different ways to do that. One idea is simply h4 to h5, trying to get that alpha 0 pawn into the game and gaining space. From there, ideas like the rook lift with rook h3 to g3 is going to be an option. In addition to that, white also has the idea of perhaps queen h3 and then f4 and g4, preparing a future f4 to f5, gaining even more space on the king side. So white's going to have a few different ideas, and black, meanwhile, has to get that queen side development going and find a way to counterattack on the king side, stopping white's plans. Okay, from here, Richard starts his idea, knight c6, and Magnus retreats the queen. His idea is actually wants to go bishop to h5, pressuring f7. Very creative stuff. Now, h6 from Richard Rapport, obviously defending the pawn on h7 that was being attacked. And now bishop to h5 from Magnus, starting that idea, just increasing the pressure. Perhaps he wants to go queen to f3 next, trying to overload f7. Now, Richard Rapport, bishop d7, continuing the plan. Now, castle's queenside is an option at any moment. And Magnus, knight to e2. Very good idea. Of course, that knight does not want to go onto the f3 square, because then after g6, bishop g4, h5, suddenly that bishop is completely trapped. Okay, knight e2 on the board. Now g6, followed by h5 from Richard Rapport. Obviously, the bishop is being kicked back, and Richard is gaining more space on the king side and slowing down white's ideas. So very solid stuff so far. Okay, from here, Richard goes knight to f5. This is a good move. The knight is very active on the f5 square. However, the one drawback of this idea is Magnus does have a hook, and that is the pawn on h5, and he takes full advantage of that and starts the attack with the move g4. Wow, okay, this is very, very committal on Magnus Carlsen's part. I mean, his king is now permanently stuck in the center. You do not want to castle kingside in this position. Okay, so what does Rapport do? He takes on g4, Magnus takes back, and now Magnus has quite a bit of pressure on that knight on f5. However, the best move here is castling long, and Richard Rapport finds it. The idea behind this move is Richard waited until the last moment. He waited until white committed to attacking on the king side with g2 to g4, and as soon as that happens, he said, okay, now is the time to castle on the other wing. White is just too far away from a queenside attack, so my king should be pretty safe on the queen side for now. Okay, how does Magnus Carlsen continue the attack from here? Well, he starts by taking the knight on f5. Now Richard has a very big choice. Do you take back with the g-pawn or with the e-pawn? In the game, Richard takes back with the e-pawn, but I think this is a big mistake. Instead, the computer likes to move g takes f5. The idea is you're keeping that really compact pawn structure in the center, and you're opening up the g-file for the rook. I mean, yes, white does have that passed h-pawn on h2, which is a little bit scary, but overall, black does have the connected rooks, and I think it should be relatively okay for him to get the rooks over to the h and g files and simply defend. But in the game, e takes f5. That certainly makes things more interesting for us, because now Magnus Carlsen is on the attack. All right, he starts bishop g5, taking advantage of those weakened dark squares in black's position, and of course, attacking the rook on the d8 square. Now, rook d8, Richard defends, and king d2. Magnus gets his king over to the defense of the c3 pawn. That is yet another benefit of the move bishop g5. Now that knight is free to move anywhere else, say f4 or g3. Okay, Richard, rook h8 attacking the queen, and queen f3, Magnus defends. Now knight d8 from Richard, good idea, rerouting that knight to the very good e6 square. Now both sides improve their pieces. Richard gets his knight to that critical e6 square, and here Magnus Carlsen makes the first major mistake of the game on his side. He plays the move h5, and this turns out to be a mistake because after g5, black's pawns are just cruising down the board, and white obviously cannot take that pawn on f5. I mean, if you take it right now, then after knight takes d4, the game is almost over on the spot with the double attack on the queen by the knight and the bishop. That is ugly. Okay, instead, after g5 from Richard Rapport, here Magnus goes rook a to e1. Very interesting move. I mean, this guy is simply sacking that pawn on a4 and just begging Richard Rapport to take it. So the question is, can he take the pawn? Well, not immediately. If he takes it right away, queen takes a4, then rook a1 is deadly. I mean, the queen retreats, Magnus takes the pawn on a7, and that king is just being blown off the board between the rooks, the other rook coming to the a1 square, and that bishop on f6, which has the entire position on lockdown. That is just no good. However, if Richard did want to take the pawn on a4, there was a way to set it up, and that is with the move a7 to a6. I mean, now, after any other move by Magnus, I don't know, rook e to g1 or something like that, Richard can always take the pawn on the a4 square, and if he does that, then after rook a1, queen c6, suddenly the pawn is defended, and Richard has a dominant position. But instead, after rook a to e1, Richard does not find the idea of a6. Instead of that, he goes f4. The idea is simply trying to get these pawns moving on the king side and avoiding any future threats on the pawn on f5. However, this is where that insane piece sacrifice that I alluded to in the intro comes into play. Magnus starts by getting the rook on the open g-file, and Richard does the same, rook g8, but here Magnus Carlsen strikes on the king side. Knight takes f4. This is an absolutely brilliant move. I mean, first of all, if Richard takes the knight on f4, then Magnus takes the rook. That is game over on the spot. Okay, so you do not want to do that. Instead, after knight takes f4, what's the right move? Well, here Richard has to sacrifice the rook to stay in the game, and that is what he does. Rook takes f6. The idea is after e takes, you take back the knight on f4, and here material somehow is even. White has the extra rook and an extra pawn. Meanwhile, black has two minor pieces, and somehow this game is relatively level. Or is it? I mean, here in this position, if you can find the right move from white, man, you deserve at least 4 happy meals for this move. This move is unbelievable. Here on move 30, Magnus Carlsen has the option of sacrificing the queen. Oh my goodness. The idea behind this move is after g takes, you take the rook, then king c7, and in this position, Magnus Carlsen only has the 2 rooks for the queen and the bishop. bishop. Normally, that is nowhere near enough. However, he has 2 trump cards. First of all, that king is surprisingly safe on d2, protected by these pawns. And more importantly, this pawn on h5 is worth at least a piece. It is threatening to promote all the way down the board. Now, I'm just going to show you the main computer line really fast to show you what could happen in this position. I mean, Magnus cleans up, picks up all the pawns, threatens to promote the pawn on the h7 square, threatening h8. And here the bishop has to take the pawn. Bishop takes, rook takes, and in the end, Magnus Carlsen has the 2 rooks for the queen. And normally the 2 rooks have a somewhat difficult time in these kinds of positions, but Magnus Carlsen's rooks are coordinating perfectly, and he still has the edge according to the computer. Now, instead of this idea, Magnus Carlsen does not go queen takes f4. Instead, he goes h5 to h6 in this position. And despite the fact that the computer likes queen takes f4 more, I actually vastly prefer Magnus Carlsen's decision here. I mean, Magnus is in complete control. There is simply no need to go down that crazy route with the queen sacrifice. Okay, from here, Richard retreats the knight, the best move, and Magnus pushes the pawn, forcing rook h8 from black. Now, our boy Magnus, queen e3. I mean, maybe this is just a coincidence, but it sure looks like Magnus is lining up the rook and the queen with that pawn on g5. Surely Magnus Carlsen is not going to sacrifice the rook on g5, right? Right? Oh boy, Magnus, he sacks the rook. Rook takes g5. What's the idea? After knight takes, queen takes, here Magnus is literally down a full piece. He has the queen and the rook versus the queen, rook, and bishop from black. However, the trump card in this position, of course, is that pawn on h5. That pawn is just a freaking monster. So from here, Magnus is going to do everything he possibly can to promote that pawn, and Richard Rapport has to hang on for dear life and somehow show this extra bishop on d7 is enough to turn the tides in his favor. From here, Richard brings the king on to c7, and Magnus goes queen g7. I mean, what is that queen attacking here? I have no clue. Now, bishop e6, rook e1. Again, what is the rook doing? This position makes no sense. Okay, king b6. King b6? Are you kidding me? All right, I give up trying to make sense of this game. We're just going to blast through this. All right, rook e5 from Magnus. What is he attacking? Zero clue. Queen c8 from Richard. Now f4. Here we go. Okay, threatening f4 to f5. I like it. a6 from Richard. I guess he's giving a retreat square for the king. I mean, someone in the chat, try and tell me what is going on here. I have no clue. Okay, king c1 from Magnus. More weird moves. King a7. And finally, Magnus gets the breakthrough with the move f5. The idea behind this move is if the bishop takes, you sack the rook, and the queen is overloaded trying to defend the rook on h8 and attack the rook. If black takes the rook, Magnus takes the rook, and this pawn is going to promote. That is game over. Okay, f5. The bishop has to retreat. Magnus is making progress. Now a5. A beautiful move from Magnus. The idea is he is just trying to lock in that king forever. If you're familiar with the computer program AlphaZero, which was developed by Google in 2018 and ended up smoking Stockfish in their one-on-one match, this is a pure AlphaZero move, simply trying to restrict the movement of the king on a7. Now, let's take a step back and look at this position. It is just unbelievable. I mean, Richard Rapport is up a bishop, but it does not matter here. I mean, that bishop, the queen, the rook, they are all locked down in the position, and meanwhile, white has everything on lockdown. That pawn on d5 is going to fall sooner or later. That pawn on h7 is restricting the black position, and this is just a boa constrictor strategy by Magnus, just locking everything down. Okay, Richard, queen f8, offering a queen trade, and here if Magnus Carlsen allows it, king b2, his idea is if you take the queen, then f takes g7, and that is game over. There is no way to stop both pawns. If you take here, I promote to a queen, and if you don't take, I don't know, rook to d8, you just push a pawn, you promote, rook takes, you get a new queen. That is just too much. Okay, king b2, and now Richard Rapport just retreats the queen. He's officially out of moves. I mean, look at Richard's last 2 moves. Queen from c8 to f8, then queen f8 to c8. I mean, just look at Richard Rapport's last 2 moves. He starts queen to f8. That does nothing. Magnus plays king b2 and then queen to c8. I mean, this is his way of admitting I have literally nothing I can do in the position. I am just going to sit sit and wait and pray that you can't find the winning combination. Okay, what does Magnus do? He starts taking the pawn on d5. Very simple move. Now, bishop c6 from Richard. Of course, with that d5 pawn gone, that bishop on c6 is now a little bit more active. Okay, rook e5 from Magnus, getting out of the attack. Bishop d7. Now, queen takes f7. Magnus is just slowly but surely gobbling up everything in the position. Now, Richard takes the pawn on f5, but Magnus is in time to force a queen trade. Rook c5, then the queen goes to e6, and the queens come off the board. Okay, big time to talk strategy. The queens are off. We are now in a literal endgame where black is up a bishop, but Magnus has that pawn on the h7 square. Okay, how on earth does he win this game? He starts rook c7, simply supporting the pawn. So far, so good. I mean, Magnus Carlsen is the GOAT of endgames. There is nobody better than him in the endgame phase of chess, and this game really shows why. Okay, bishop f5, threatening the pawn. Rook g7. Magnus Carlsen's idea is if you take the pawn with the bishop, I go f7. And oh my goodness, Magnus Carlsen here wins by force no matter what. If you like puzzles, pause the video and try and figure out the idea. It is beautiful despite being an endgame. Okay, the idea. Let's say Richard wastes a move. I don't know. What can you do in this position? He goes king b8, wasting a move. Here, Magnus takes the bishop and the rook is overloaded. Oh my goodness, if you take the rook, f8, queen wins the game. And if you don't take the rook, let's say rook f8, Magnus just goes rook g7 and he is threatening rook g8 next move. And even if that doesn't work out, he has too many pawns. He wins this pawn on c4. This D pawn is going to run down the board. And in this position, Richard Rapport plays one last trick. Yes, he has one last trick up his sleeve. He plays the insane move, bishop to d3. Now, what's the idea behind this? Well, he is just trying to trick Magnus Carlsen somehow, but it does not work. Magnus Carlsen takes the pawn, then he goes king c1. That pawn is never ever going to promote. That is game over. And in this position, on move 52, Richard Rapport resigns. Wow, what a game. Now, before you go, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, which is up there on your screen right now, and I will see you in the next video.